Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Friends of Gaming. My name is Chris from Winter Moon Games, and today I'm excited to have my friend of the gaming world and my guest, Tim Blank, who is the Vice President of BostonFig, the President of Game Makers Guild, and a game designer professor at Northeastern University. A lot of other things, too. So, welcome to the show, Tim. Thanks for
Thanks for
being
having me,
here.
Chris.
Yeah, so that's just some of your titles. How long you been around in the industry doing the various things that you do?
Yeah, I've been in the industry for about 6 years. I primarily view myself as a game designer, though. I have all these other things that I do in the industry, but I always tell myself that I go back to being a game designer because that's what I love, and that's really what opened me up to all these other opportunities that I have. I've been in the industry, like I said, I think about 6 years, maybe a little longer. I started with the Game Makers Guild. I was at PAX East, and a member of the Game Makers Guild had come up to me and was showing me his indie game, and then was telling me a little bit about the Game Makers Guild. Then I went to Boston Fig and I saw more members of the Game Makers Guild. And then so I started going to it, and here I am years later running it. So that's it.
And Boston Fig is a great event. I've been a part of it as a exhibitor 1 year, and it was honestly, and I'm not just saying this to try and butter you up. It was one of the highlights of my quote unquote gaming career. I had a blast. It was the first time I had a chance to demo my game for an actual convention, and Boston Fig is like it's growing obviously, but when I first started going, it was still small, and but there was a huge crowd and people were wanting to play my game, and I for like 8 hours didn't have a break. It was awesome. What has been the evolution of Boston Fig that you've seen over the
Yeah.
years?
Well, so the great thing about Boston Fig, to kind of speak to what you were just saying too, is that it's an indie game festival. So the people who show up there, they're not looking for the big games from the big companies. They're not looking. We also have a digital game presence there as well. They're not looking for games from big AAA companies. They're going there because they want to play indie games that people have made, games they've never heard of, games that might never actually make it to a store. Um, just these smaller indie games, and so that's why they're excited to be there, and I think that's one of the reasons that makes it great. I started with Boston Fig. I'm now in my 6th year of running Boston Fig. So yeah, I think I've been in the industry longer than 6 years if this is my 6th year of running Boston Fig. um, and yeah, we started out, the first year I went, it was really small. I want to say there was only like 20, 25 games that made it into the festival, and now we are consistently pulling in over 100 games that are applying. We usually bring about 40 to 50 games into the festival every year. Just this last year, we moved over to Harvard. We used to be held at MIT, but Harvard has much bigger facilities. And so we're able to grow. And this year is, we are really happy to announce that we are a 2-day festival instead of a 1-day festival. So that right there just goes to show how much we're growing.
That is so cool, and I'm really happy to know you. And also, you're local. You're one of the people that I know that's actually within driving distance of being able to hang out, play games with, and also
Yeah, I
collaborate
live
with.
in Boston,
And
so
yeah,
that's yeah.
yeah. So talk a little bit about your other interests. Maybe aside from gaming, I wanted to have you maybe talk a little bit more about you as a person. So maybe where are you from, and tell me about your life and what your interests are outside of
Yeah,
gaming.
so I grew up in Rhode Island, so not far, and I moved to Boston probably about 8 years ago. And I moved here for work and for a relationship. And kind of, when I got here, that's what I was doing. Before I got into games, I actually am a classically trained musician. So I play a lot of different instruments, and that was kind of like my thing outside of work. And so I played a bunch of instruments. I was in a couple of local groups and stuff like that. But then I got up to Boston. When I started here, kind of work took over my life. And once work started getting a little bit more manageable, that's when I really got into game design. I was that guy that, and everyone has an idea for a board game, right? You tell anyone that you're a board game designer, and they're always like, yeah, I have this idea. And I took that next step of turning that idea into an actual board game, and here I am. Outside of game design, I do a couple of other things. My primary job, my full-time job, is I am an academic advisor at Northeastern. So I work with adult students in their College of Professional Studies, and just kind of help them finish their degrees there. And that's also where I teach game design as well. So
Where do you find the time?
so I've heard of this mythical thing. It's called sleep. Some people tell me that they get a lot of it. Yeah, no. It's really, for me, it's prioritizing. Really just knowing what's important to me. I'm also, I haven't even mentioned this yet, I'm pursuing a doctorate degree as well. So I've got that competing with for my time. But it's really just prioritizing, and it's, planning your time out and knowing, Monday night, I've got Game Makers Guild. Tuesday and Wednesday, I'm working on my schoolwork. Thursday, I'm doing this. Friday, I'm doing that, and just planning it out ahead of time. It really also helps that I have a partner who's really supportive of a lot of this stuff.
And this comes up a lot on this show when I interview people, is juggling life, because that's what everyone is doing. And I think that we've always talked about that first step is always the hardest. So skip right to the second step. And the second step is just getting into that routine. Once you have a routine, things become just a lot more natural, and you're like, oh, this isn't so bad, and I can totally manage the other things that I'm doing. So yeah, that's great. Can you talk a little bit about some of your favorite aspects of working in the gaming community? Because the gaming community, when you say I'm in the community, that can mean a lot of things. And obviously, you're doing a lot of things. But what are some of the things you personally, as Tim, what do you get out of being around the community, and what are some of the things you look forward to?
I'd say the biggest thing is there's just a lot of really good people in the industry. So I've been doing this for many years. I go to conventions, I go to design conventions. I'm part of a lot of online communities. I mean, right now we're doing all of our playtesting online. So there's just a lot of really good people who want to help each other, and that's kind of the good thing about this industry. It's really unlike a lot of other industries that are really cutthroat and competitive and all of that. One thing with the board game industry is there's the saying that rising tides rise all ships, or that saying right there. And that's like a big thing for the board game industry. Designers want to help each other to make great games, because the better our games are, the more people are going to play them, and the more people who play them, the bigger our industry gets and the more it grows. And there's just a lot of really good people there. I've made a lot of really good friends over the years. And I've traveled around the country with them, going to all these different conventions, and so it's a lot of fun getting to know people, and then just being creative, and being creative with them and throwing ideas out there. That's a great thing that brings so creative people together.
What are some challenges that you face as a designer?
I would say the biggest one for me is doing the iteration on my games. So I've got lots of ideas, and all game designers will tell you that they've got dozens of ideas going around in their head. And actually getting the time to put it together, putting it on paper, play testing it with people, and then taking that feedback that you get and creating a new version of the game so you can play test that. For me, that's a big thing. I do have a friend, we're co-designing a game right now, and he's really big on like, all right, like we need to pump this out. We need to pump this out. And so that's something that I found was really motivating to me, because I typically am just a solo designer, but to have someone there who's also relying on me every other Monday for Game Makers Guild to have a new version of this game, printed up and all of that. That was kind of the fire under my butt that I needed in order to make sure that we were iterating on this game.
Yeah, totally. Yep. And having that accountability is huge. It can take you from, not so much success to actually achieving success when you have someone else who's on your back, or you can both bounce ideas off each other. And, I'm with you. I'm a solo designer myself, but it's hard. when you don't have other people, even just to talk to about
Right.
ideas.
And
Um,
it's funny because we will, a couple months ago, we were at Metatopia and we had gone to, we were sharing a hotel room there and we had gone back to the hotel room and he was like, oh, I got this new idea. And we just sat there for like an hour and a half, just spitting ideas out of like, what could
yeah,
this new game be? And then by the end of that hour and a half, we were like, we need to make a prototype of this because this sounds like it's going to be a really fun game. And I
yeah,
wouldn't have had that conversation with myself, at least not for an
right,
hour and a half. So, to
yeah.
have that extra accountability there, we created something that, we're hopefully going to be moving forward with and hopefully getting
Yeah.
it published soon.
And for life in general, I don't believe we're necessarily meant to go through it
Right.
alone. I mean, there's a reason there are people around us, and we have this thing we talk about called
Mm-hmm.
community, and the gaming industry is so open to people who want to be a part of this hobby and learn how great, why it's so great.
Well, I mean, that's
And
kind of the nature of board games too. You have to get together with other people and play them. And, so if you don't have a game design community, and I'm a huge advocate for game design communities, I can go over, statistics and reasons why and all of that. But if you don't have a game design community, that's going to be a huge block for you as a designer. And so I get a lot of designers, they know that I run the Game Makers Guild, they know that I run BostonFig, and these are two huge game design communities. And they come to me and they're like, hey, I'm in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska, and I need to find people. What can I do? And, I'm working with people constantly trying to help them find local game design communities or even online playtesting communities so they have something where they can go or somewhere where they can go and actually have other people there. You can't do game design by yourself. Even with a solo game, you need to get other ideas, going in that.
yeah, and in some ways, why would you want to do it by yourself, right? Because that's what you're eventually going to want other people to play your game,
Right.
and you got to make sure other people can enjoy
Well,
it,
yeah, and I
right?
mean,
So,
you're eventually
you know,
hopefully going to be selling your game and promoting your game and doing
yeah,
all of that stuff. And if you never talk to
right.
someone else about your game, and suddenly you're thrust into this, convention environment where you're talking to thousands of
Mm-hmm.
people about your game, that's going to be really difficult if you've done the whole thing by yourself.
Right. That was my biggest flaw when I first started designing. But let's talk about Game
Mhm.
Makers Guild a little bit. I think, and this again, I'm not trying to butter you up. I went to the North of Boston meetup
Yep.
one time, and then I came to the one that was
Yep.
in Boston that you host. When I went to the North of Boston one, it was my first time ever going to a Game Makers Guild event, and I absolutely had a
Oh,
blast. And that night, I came home and was like, I need to work on another game. I want to be able to make a game and bring it to people so they can play it and give me criticism, because I just loved being around. And every game I played it was so good. Like I was like, I got to be around these people all the time. And of course, life gets busy, and I haven't been
right.
back since. But even at the Boston one, which is a much larger group, I mean, it goes from like north of Boston, which is like 12, to in Boston, that's probably, well, how many are there? Like 25.
Yeah, we
I mean, it's
usually get
huge.
30 to 40 people per night. So
But you're getting that many people to get eyes on your game, give you feedback, and sometimes too many cooks, like that can be an issue sometimes. But like everybody there is there because they want to make your game and their
right.
games better. So with that in mind, how have you seen the industry personally evolve in a positive way, and what role have you played in kind of helping that stay the course?
Well, so I think the biggest thing is game design communities, and like I said, like I've been a huge advocate for these game design communities because I run some, but I also see the amazing things that come out of it, and I see the games that come out of Game Makers Guild, and we've got these huge companies that are putting them out there, and these designers who are really getting their names out there because they took a game to Game Makers Guild and brought it there for a year and a half, 2 years, play tested it, all these different versions, made it better, and now these huge companies are taking a look at it. And for me, it's these games. it's really the games that are evolving, I think, not so much the industry. The industry is evolving to a degree, but it's the seeing these games go from this idea that someone just has, where it's not even really a game, where they're just like, hey, I got this core mechanic and I want to see if it's going to work. And if you're lucky enough to sit down at one of those tables and see this and give some ideas that help shape it, and then 2 years later you see this game come out that uses this core mechanic, but it's totally different, and you get to watch this game evolve. That's something that I think is amazing. It's something that, when I sit down, when I finally get this finished product and I'm sitting down with my friends playing it, I get to be like, oh yeah, I was a part of this game. I did a lot of play testing on it, and it's always great sometimes too to pull out this idea of like, oh yeah, we talked about that, and that was kind of my idea.
It is definitely fun when you use like, oh, someone
Yeah.
used my idea. I let's talk about the
Okay.
pandemic a little bit, because it's obviously
Yep.
relevant right now, right? In your opinion, right now you're doing a lot of play testing and demoing via
Mhm.
the internet. I'm sure you're using things like Tabletop Simulator, Tabletopia,
Yep.
things like that, or even just Discord and
Mhm.
talking about stuff. But let's say, okay, we're quarantined for 9 months, right? We have no idea how long this is going to go on for, or what the future holds for next year when COVID comes
Yep.
back, right? In your opinion, how does an outbreak like this, where people now are forced to be isolated, change the dynamic of the future of something like board games, when, okay, board games are all about being physically
Yeah.
present? So how does that
Yeah.
change? Is it positively or negatively?
Both. One thing that I'm seeing right now is there are a lot of people who now suddenly have more time on their hands and they can devote it to their crafts. On the flip side of that, there are people who have less time on their hands or are worrying about their other responsibilities in life, so they can't really focus on their creative, their hobby, all of that. So it's, you get a little bit of this and a little bit of that. When it comes to play testing, there are a lot more designers who are available to do playtesting, but at the same time, you have that online playtesting, and there is something that is lost when you're just doing online playtesting. You don't always get the full player dynamics, and those social dynamics are one of the pillars of game design. When you have people sitting around a table and they're having fun with this game, um, and they're able to look at each other and laugh and read each other's nonverbal body language, all of that. So there's a lot of social dynamics there that get lost with online play testing. But at the same time, you can use that to your strength and say, you know what, we're going to focus on the mechanics of this game right now. We're not going to really look at the social dynamics, and you really get to pull stuff out of the game, and focus on that and work on that. Sorry.
And it takes away a little bit. Oh, hello, kitty. It takes away a little bit too, maybe, of like that tactile aspect too. Like, you're not able to physically touch the nice components and the pretty components that the publishers have spent all this money designing and manufacturing.
Yeah.
But I think that that's just something we have to adapt to, and we will get through it. Like, it's not like this is the end of
Right.
the world and we're never going to play board games in person again. But yeah, so that is definitely
that's
encouraging.
and that's very true too. And so there are a lot of games that rely on those components. You think of dexterity games, you think of, there's just so many games out there that, components are absolutely, again, those are one of those pillars of game design right there that can make or break a game. And if you have a game that relies on the components, you're not going to get the same thing out of it with Tabletop Simulator as you would with people sitting around the table. And I think we're going to see some changes in the industry because, depending on how long this goes on for, there are going to be some changes in the industry within the next year or two where we might see some games that don't rely as heavily on those social dynamics or on those components. I think we're going to start seeing a lot more solo games that are coming out, and there's just a lot of companies and board game personalities out there that are encouraging games that can be played, um, you know, either through webcam or on tabletop simulator or even just solo games or print and play games. And I think that we're going to see some of those start creeping into the finished product aspect of the community.
So as a designer, I see
Hmm.
Babuntu
Yep.
behind you. by the way. You've designed how many games with your name as the credit as the designer?
So currently published right now, I have two games. So Oh My Gods is
Okay.
my first one that I co-published with Breaking Games. And
Hmm.
then Bamuntu right here is the one that I just most recently published with WizKids. But with that, I have a number of other games that I've kind of non-traditionally published. So a big thing
Hmm.
that I've been working on lately is escape rooms and small, like 10-minute escape rooms, and bringing those to conventions. And I usually do it for charity. So I'll bring it to a convention and I'll, ask for a $5 donation per person to that charity. And then you get to play a 10-minute escape room. And the escape room lives on like a 6-foot table. It's got a huge background. It's actually got furniture in it, and you're picking things up and opening things up and undoing locks. So it's just like, your traditional hour-long one that you'd go to a facility to do. And so that's kind of been a huge focus of my game design lately, is really bringing this kind of other thing that no one else really does. Like, I've never seen anyone else do a 10-minute escape room like this at these types of conventions. And so bringing that type of stuff to the
Yeah.
industry and really stretching people's ideas of what a game is, or just giving them these really different play experiences.
And I have yet to play one of your escape rooms, but I am still wanting to. I've always loved that idea, and I remember talking to you about it a little bit, just wanting to do it. Whenever I first went to escape room, I was like, okay, I know what my calling is. I gotta make
Yeah,
escape rooms. They're so fun. Do you enjoy doing
I
escape rooms
love
anyway?
doing them. And it's actually funny because I look at the types of games that I design and the types of games that I gravitate toward, and they tend to be really puzzly. Like, Oh My Gods is a deduction game, so you're trying to figure something out. But Muntu, you've got all these pieces on the board and you're trying to connect the pieces together in kind of like a puzzle type way. And then I look at all the other types of games that I really like to play, and they have a puzzly aspect. And escape rooms are really just taking that puzzly aspect and exploiting it. And if you think about it, an escape room is just one giant puzzle. And you're just going through step by step in order to solve it. So I love designing them. But with designing them also comes the problem of, you can't have the same playtester playtest that room twice, because once they've solved all the puzzles,
It's a really
yeah.
good point.
So that's the challenge in designing an escape room.
Yeah. So, which of the two is your favorite design? Would you say, and
Oh
why?
God, they have so many different. They're different games. So I would say right now I'm more excited about Bamuntu. Not that I'm not excited about Oh My Gods, I still love that. But with Bamuntu, it's the more recent game for me. And I've been doing Oh My Gods for 5 years now. Going to conventions with it, selling it. Trying to just get the game out there. And I've always had this kind of rule when it comes to designing a game, where if I fall out of love with a game, I stop working on it. Because for me, if you are going to be designing a game, you need to be the biggest champion for that game. If you can't sit there for 3 years and talk about this game and talk about how much you love this game and how great this game is, then no one else is going to get excited about that game. And so I think with Oh My Gods, I'm starting that downward turn for it. But it's still a great game.
That's really good advice, actually, especially for me. I've been working on my game for a long time, and I haven't had it published yet, and I keep hitting roadblock after roadblock. I mean, you've been hearing me talk about my game for the past 6 years, 5 years, whatever, and it was my game I brought to BostonFig. But it's one of those things where you really do have. You're right. That was like, you really have to be able to love what you've created and just decide, I'm going to invest in this no matter what. And there's a big, I think, part of design where you have to realize, like, hey, this isn't working, and the best thing I can do is cut it off. Oops, sorry. The best thing I can do is cut it off like dead weight and throw it away and move on. Either like a mechanic that isn't working, right? Have you ever encountered
Oh
that
yeah, all the
before,
time.
where you just have to like lop off something that's
Yeah.
not working?
All the time. Normally, I would venture to say most of the time, and when I say most of the time, like 90% of the time, if you're having trouble with a game, it's because you need to take something out of the game, not add to the game. And that's a big thing that I try to, I see a lot of new designers, I see my students do this as well, where they're like, all right, so we need this aspect to it, so I'm going to introduce this whole other aspect of this game. And I'm like, no, 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 don't do that. Take a look, try to streamline this game. The big question that I have everyone ask when they're looking at their game is this necessary? You look at each aspect of that game and you ask yourself that. And if it's not necessary and it's not working, you cut it out. You get rid of it. It's going to tighten your game a lot more. It's going to keep that experience that you want your players to have, but it's just going to make it a lot more streamlined. And you do sometimes have to add stuff to games. Like that's very true. If you have this super simple game and you want something more complex, you're going to have to add something to it. But my go-to when I'm looking at a game and I'm looking at a problem of the game is what can I cut from the game before I start adding something to it. And I look at the way that I design games and I start seeing, the complexity go in and out and in and out. And that's because, again, I add something to it and then I start cutting it, and then add something to it and cut. But it's mostly cutting stuff out of games.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but designing games is like doing anything else. The more you do it, the better you get at it. Right?
Yeah. I mean, that
in some ways, yeah. I guess. I mean, obviously, you can't teach someone how to be creative and innovative.
No, I will 100% disagree with you on that.
You will? Okay.
Teach creativity. Creativity is a skill, just like learning a musical instrument or learning a language or anything like that. The more you practice it, the better you will get at.
Like what you can. Okay. So you, as a professor, you've probably been able to.
Week 2 in my class is the creative process and brainstorming and creative thinking. And I've taken students who have started their class saying, the reason I'm taking this class is because I'm not a creative person and I want to learn a little bit more about that. And then by the end are coming out with some pretty awesome and weird and creative things. There's research out there that shows that you can teach creativity.
I honestly believe that everyone is creative. Some people just, like you said, maybe it's and maybe I misspoke. Maybe that's what I should have said instead, is like, I think that everyone is potentially able to create and create well, but you have to kind of like tap into that.
You have to do it. You have to commit to it. And that's the thing with game design. And I think that's where you're going with it, is you have to commit to it and you have to stick to it. Like we were talking about falling in love and falling out of love with games. And one thing that you mentioned was that you experience frustrations with your games. And I liken my relationship to these games kind of like a romantic relationship, but not that like I'm in love with my games, but that it's, you have to love your game. You are going to have some frustrations and you are going to have some moments where you're like, all right, I need to compromise on some things. Maybe I need to cut this mechanic in order to really get the full experience that I want. But the important thing there is that when you're being frustrated, you don't just say like, all right, I'm done and I'm going to shelve this game. Because if you still love that game and you still want to continue to work on it, you got to let that shine through and work through those frustrations. Because game design is work. And either you're going to love it and you're going to continue with the game, or you're going to get frustrated. And I've seen a lot of new designers who they have this new game and they come to Game Makers Guild and they see some frustrations with their games and then they never come back because they're like, you know what, this thing wasn't for me. And you got to make that decision that it is for you.
I gotta admit, I've been there, and I definitely sometimes struggle. And I think hearing your advice, I'm gonna let that resonate in me, and hopefully everybody who's listening, who's an aspiring game designer, will as well. It's really encouraging. Thank you for sharing that. And I appreciate when people like you or folks that are open to just saying like, no, I don't agree with what you're saying because I've experienced it this way. It opens up my perspective to think like, hey, that's totally true, and I need to rethink how I'm looking at this, perhaps, because maybe I'm looking at it too negatively, because maybe I've been looking at it too long, things like that. And so, thank you for sharing your advice as an instructor and as a designer.
I see that happen with so many designers where they are just so entrenched into what this game is supposed to be that they're not seeing what it could be. Or
I think that the hardest thing is taking criticism sometimes when something you've especially poured so much time into. Do you know I'm drawing a blank on his name, the designer of Burgle Bros. Yeah, Tim. I forget his last name, but he's also Tim.
There's so many Tims in the industry.
So many Tims. He told me one time like, hey, he was talking about my game. I was sharing with him how long I've been working on it. He said, you're gonna have issues with people giving any kind of feedback on your game because you're so invested in it. And he was right. It was a really hard to hear that, but when I absorbed it and said, no, I have to take this as truth and I have to compartmentalize it and use it for the future, it helped me. I think really just taking criticism and not letting it stop you from going back to Game Maker's Go
Right.
ever again, you know? But yeah, so and the last question I want to kind of pitch to you is, as a
Hmm.
professor, what is one thing that you've learned maybe from your students who are novices, or whatever, that's made you a better designer?
Um,
I know it's a surprise
yeah,
question. I didn't tell you I was going to ask this, but I would just, in the conversation, the way it's flowing, it sounds like you're seeing a lot of inspiration in your
I
classes.
am.
So I'm curious if you've seen anything that's jumped out at you that said like, oh, I never really thought of it that way, or maybe I'll do this differently
Well,
next
so
time.
one thing that I think is really unique about my students is I have a large number of international students in my class. So they're coming from literally all around the world, all these different countries, and they're coming to game design with a different perspective. And there is a lot that individuals from other countries that I think we as game designers and people who have been in the industry, we kind of take for granted. And we assume that there are these things about games that everyone knows. And people from other countries, they come, I mean, even just giving them like a story. I remember we were talking about meaningful decisions in one of our classes, and I brought up the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And they had no idea what this story was. And so that was something that I just kind of took for granted. But then there are other things when I'm talking to them about that are like more game specific, where you it's a different perspective, where it's actually, I think it's helped me with writing rules to my games as well, where I can't take for granted that my players know all of this stuff, that you know that I need to tell them that they need to shuffle the deck before they do this, or that when they play a card from their hand, they can't, where they have to play it, and stuff like that. So and it's just given me a different perspective on um, culture in games. So one thing that I am really big on when I design games is that I want my games to have some kind of cultural education aspect to them. And I think that there are a lot, like, for me, that's something that's really important to me. And with game design being my art form, this is how I can kind of use my art form to teach others about cultures. And there's a lot that I think that there's ways that I personally, as a designer, can be better about introducing culture into my games, and talking to my students about that, and seeing the mistakes that they make using their culture and then trying to adapt it to American culture as well. There's a lot more to that conversation than I think that I have um,
Sure.
been keeping in the forefront of my mind for the past couple of years.
It's funny that you say that because I was just talking to my wife about this. I've been watching a lot more international
Hmm.
films. Like, I'm a big film guy,
Yep.
TV guy, and I have found that there's a quality and an attention to detail from some of these international films because it's a different
Hmm.
perspective. They grew up in a different culture with different priorities and with different struggles, and so that is then translated into their art, which is their movies
Hmm.
and their TV and like you said, in their games. And I am finding that in some ways I'm seeing originality that I've never seen before because I'm watching some of these films and I'm really
Hmm.
inspired by it, and it makes me want to like, oh, I want to make a game
Yeah.
about that now. So like I can see that with a lot of international students that you have probably having the same experiences, and that's really a huge blessing to us as people to experience other cultures and be able to learn from them and then use them to enhance our own creations,
Yeah. And I mean,
So, yeah.
the one of the most fascinating things that I ever saw in game design, and I think I got it somewhere up here on my shelf, is the game Team 3. And I don't know if you've ever played that, but it's kind of
I have. It's a
yeah,
good
it's a good
game.
game. It's a co-op game where you have one person who can talk and one person who can't see and one person who can't hear, and they're trying to build the structure together. And I had a group of three of my students, and they were all from China, and so they were playing it in Chinese. Yeah, you got it right
Yep, there we
there.
go. Over
Yeah.
the camera. Team
And
3.
to just sit there
Yeah.
and watch them play it, like I understood what they were doing and what they were saying. And there was also this really interesting thing of watching them play it. I recognized some of the strategies that they were using of that were similar to what my friends and I use when we play it. But it was in a completely different culture. I didn't understand a single word that they were saying, but I still completely understood how that they were playing this game. It was just an absolutely fascinating experience to watch.
It really is. It's a
Yeah.
universal language, you know. Well, we're just about out of time, and I feel like we could talk for a long time. I really love the perspective of a designer, and I've always appreciated that, you know, you as a person are always willing to talk to people and encourage people and help people. That's one of the, you were one of the first people in the industry that I met that I considered was, you know, I knew you as an established designer, and you were also doing all these events, and I was very encouraged when you would take the time to talk with me and be honest with me about my game and my designs and things like that.
Yeah,
So thank
like
you.
we were
And
saying, we
yeah.
were talking a little before this, and we were saying about
Mhm.
one of the things I love about this industry is that there is no designer that is too big to sit down and talk to you. Like, you could take the biggest name designer or the biggest name celebrity from this industry, and they will sit down and have a beer with you at a bar and talk about board games about with you. And that, I absolutely love that about this industry.
If you're willing, if anybody's curious about how they can learn more about Boston Fig or Game Makers Guild, or what you're doing, what you're designing, do you want to just share a little bit about how people can contact you or how to find you, or is that
Yeah.
something you?
So best way
Yeah.
to find me would be probably Twitter. It's at Tim Makes Games, all one word. Just Tim Makes Games. Lucky enough to have gotten that. And if you're interested, I share a lot of information about Boston Fig through my Twitter. But Boston Fig has its own Twitter that's at Boston Fig, so Boston FIG. And then Game Makers Guild has their own Twitter as well, is GMG_Boston. And then if you're local to Boston, we also have Game Makers Guild chapters in New Haven, in Nashville, in Philadelphia, in Southern Idaho, and in Hartford. So if you're interested in joining one of those Game Makers Guilds, you can just go to gamemakersguild.com, and there's more information about them there.
Cool. And I will put those links in the comment or in the description of the
Perfect.
video so people can find it easier. So, Tim, thank you so much for your time. If anybody's watching this, definitely check out Bamuntu. It's a really fun game. I bought it. I think I got the last copy of it when I found it at the game store. It's really easy to play, and it's a lot of
Thank you.
fun. So, Tim, thanks, man, for your time. I appreciate you and everything you're doing.
Thanks.
So, I hope that we can have you back on
Yeah, I
again
would love to.
sometime.
This is fun. And especially, in this time right now, to see someone else and
Yeah.
talk to them.
Yeah, exactly. Even if it's virtual, I'm here for you,
Yeah,
man. I'm
yeah.
here for you.
I'm actually off to do some playtesting right now. So,
Yeah, okay, awesome. Well, thanks, man. And if anybody's interested in watching more Winter Moon Games content, you can go to wintermoongames.com/content. We're on all of your social media platforms of choice. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and we stream on Twitch. And feel free to send me an email if you have a question about this show or you want me to forward something over to Tim, cb@wintermoongames.com. Anyway, everybody, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.